Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an institute for the humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to have a conversation with Dr. Harriet Fraad. We're going to talk about family precarity and late-stage capitalism. And before we get to know a little bit about Harriet, just one announcement concerning Apocatastasis. And that is very shortly, we're going to have a course running on historical cycles. It's called The Sons of Issachar. And we're going to look over 10 weeks at different interpretations of the stages of history. This is an old, very old and ancient idea. And it is one that lately has been revived with the popularity of The Fourth Turning, a book from the 1990s. But in this course, we're going to actually go back to the classical world, the ancient world. We're going to look at different scholars who have explored this topic all the way through. We're going to look at Vico and Spengler and people in the 20th century, Arnold Toynbee, and take a look at that if you're interested in a deeper study in history and historiography. It's called The Sons of Issachar. And with that announcement being seen to, Harriet, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you're in New York City, is that correct?
Yes.
Excellent. I don't normally talk to people from New York City, although this morning I was in touch with another show guest in a few weeks from Queens. So where about in New York are you?
Manhattan.
Manhattan. All right. We're racking up the boroughs there. So
yes.
Very good. Very good. So, Harriet, tell us a bit about yourself professionally and your interests, and we'll go from there.
Okay. I have a doctorate degree in counseling and child development from Columbia. I've been in practice for 50 years. You could see I'm old. And I have always been committed to social, political, and economic justice in my whole life. I was active against the war in Vietnam, one of our early wars we lost. And I was a founding mother of the feminist movement in 1969. I read the first periodical put out by the New Women's Liberation Movement called Notes from the First Year, 1968. From my sister, not only a biological, but a psychological sister, and got inspired and said, we got to do that here. We started out, I called 5 women from the committees against the war in Vietnam, and within a month, we had 100 people. It was a movement whose time had come, and we had a free office space in the American Independent Movement office, which was against the war in Vietnam at the time, and a left movement. And from there, it burgeoned. And I have been a founder of 4 or 5 different movements, all for social justice. I'm not going to go into it here. It'll take too much time, but whatever. Anyway, and now I spend a lot of time trying to bring the capitalist decline and its terrible results to people's awareness. And some of them are not terrible, they're wonderful. But while, I have lived through the transformation of marriage, the transformation of family, the transformation of gender relationships, and seen their huge, huge turn. And so that, and that's what I study, that's what I do. In addition to seeing clients, I don't say patients, it's too hierarchical. I don't think people are sick. I just think they have trouble in life and need help. But so that's where I am today. I do my podcast through Democracy at Work, which is an organization on the left devoted to, among other things, it's called Democracy at Work, based on the work of Richard Wolff and Stephen Resnick, who believe that you can't have a real democracy if your livelihood is utterly controlled by somebody who has a capacity to put you into poverty if they decide to outsource or do something else, and that real democracy would mean that at every workplace, the workers would decide what to do, what to produce, how to produce it, and how to allocate the proceeds, so that people would never decide to outsource their jobs and be without a job, but they might cut back sometimes. I was in Mondragon, which is a city in Spain that is a city of 104 co-ops of this kind. And the whole feeling when you go in there, they have no cops. It's very nice. And what they do is people make the decisions. Everyone has to be in a decision-making meeting, and they elect representatives. And even the head representative can't be paid more than 8 times more than the average worker, and can be taken out of that position by a vote from the majority. And I toured a factory that made washing machines, the Frigor factory. And I talked to one of the women on the line who was stuffing parts into the metal frame of the dishwasher and clothes washer. And I said, how do you like working here? What are some of the challenges? And she said, we had a challenge. We're in Spain. During the pandemic, people stopped buying houses in Spain as vacation houses, and our sales had to be cut back. So we had a meeting of the factory and decided, do we want to take one day off because we need to produce less? And that would mean we'd get less money. Do we need to fire some people and put them in other co-ops? Or what should we do? And we decided we would take a day off and fire no one and just get less money. And she said, it's less money, but at least we decided together. That's the way it works. And I think it's a great concept. And that is an organization that has many podcasts. The most famous is probably Economic Update with Richard Wolff, which has about 1 million subscribers.
Great, thank you. And just by way of housekeeping, if there's ever a delay between Harry and myself for the audience's sake, it's just because I'm turning on and off the mic, and sometimes the computer stomps its heels, and it's a little bit longer taking hold. So there's that. And then also, if people are unfamiliar with the word, by the way, Harriet's site is here on our bubble, and also her work on democracy at work. And those links are down below in the description. But also by way of housekeeping, there's this unusual word in the title, precarity, family precarity. So that adjective is meaning kind of an uncertain or a dangerous condition. So that's our focus here. And in fact, it was a presentation on the part of Harriet's that got me to reach out to her, looking at this very topic. And, I think that's one of the great insights of the left is, questioning structures that we all get caught up into. And, this vitality she describes at this factory in Spain, where they're, thinking about, realities economically and how do we not leave everyone out in the cold with that and whatever. In America, we're so hidebound to a system. We don't question it. And before I kick things over to Harry, and maybe she could give us a breakdown of maybe neoliberalism or late-stage capitalism regarding families, just a synopsis in a second. We happen to be, I don't normally make a reference to this, but we do happen to be up on the end of October. And as of this recording in these United States, the SNAP, which is like food benefits for families who need it, who are precarious, those may or may not be cut off on the 1st of November. As of now, they will be. We'll find out what happens. But I thought, my goodness, what an interesting timing for our topic of family uncertainty economically in this country to have this very grim potential cutoff of food, and how it's bringing out a lot of we've kicked this can down the road for so long. And I wonder, Dr. Fraad, if you can encapsulate maybe the last few decades of how we ended up here, and the various stepping stones to this very stressful situation. I don't mean just the food stuff. I'm just talking the situation of families in this country economically.
Yeah, well, I think it's the result of a lot of things. One is that we have had an unchallenged capitalism since the 1950s, so that those forces that push workers' rights, that push average people's rights, that push benefits, that push things like the universal health care that most developed countries have, or the universal child care that they have, is pushed by the socialists and by the communist people. So that in France, you have universal health care because they have a very powerful socialist presence. And they have a powerful communist presence that pushes public rights all the time. So they can't get away with the kind of system we have here, where so few things are available to people, and now with Trump, fewer and fewer. And that really started happening after World War II with the McCarthy era in the 50s. What happened is during World War II, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had a lot of socialists and communists really working for him, his labor secretary, the first female cabinet member, labor secretary, was Frances Perkins, who was a frank socialist. Well, what had happened to allow the New Deal to continue, that gave us Social Security, that gave people unemployment insurance, that employed at that time 11 million people. For the population we have now, it would be about 22 million people at good jobs in the arts and in constructing dams and roads and things that benefited people. He, in a depression, which happened in 1929, where did he get the money? Well, he was very rich, from an old wealthy family. He went to his wealthy compatriots and he said to them, "You'd better allow me to tax you at 96.8%, or they'll take it all," because there were powerful socialist and communist movements in the United States. In the streets of New York, there were tens of thousands of unemployed people demanding jobs and rights. And when people were evicted, the Communist Party had organized a whole group to come and put their furniture back as soon as the cops left. And there was a whole militancy here. And so the wealthy, after FDR died, the wealthy thought, oh no, this cannot proceed, particularly since it was combined during World War II with an alliance with the Soviet Union. On the radio, Joseph Stalin during World War II was referred to as Uncle Joe. Whoa. And 1 out of every 4 families in the United States had a Communist Party member who was active. It was just like being an active Democrat then. And their slogan at the time was, "Communism is the new Americanism." Very different environment. They decided, our wealth is endangered. We should organize. And their vehicle for knocking out socialism and communism and ideas that the wealth should be taxed, their primary concern, was the House of Un-American Activities Committee, where everyone that decided that everyone who was a socialist was a fellow traveler to communists, and they decided that communists' aim was to overthrow the United States, even though there really was no evidence of that. They were trying very hard to be part of the United States at that time. At any rate, that took hold. The Congress allowed it. And tens of thousands of people were fired from their jobs because they were part of a group or a labor group or a socialist group or a communist group, or they were deported, or they were jailed. And that was very destructive to a left in the United States and to the whole concept of class. Class only really came back as a concept, a dominant concept in 2011 with the Occupy movements talking about the 1% and the 99%. And they were wiped out on the same day across this whole country from the top. But the concept remained. And so that started to be reinvigorated. We have to remember in 1950, 35% of workers in America were unionized. So they raised the standards for all employment. Now 9.9% are unionized because they threw the communists out of the union, and then the socialists who were suspected as fellow travelers, and all the activists, and all activities of every kind were held as suspect, whether they were photography clubs or anything else. And Americans retreated to their own TV. Meantime, in the mid-70s, American capitalists had an opportunity to outsource because fast jet travel and computers and inventions like faxes allowed huge corporations to go overseas so that wealthy capitalist corporations could pay at the most. China had the highest wages at $5 an hour instead of 30 or 25, which they were paying here. Plus, they had no ecological constraints and no benefits. So they went overseas, leaving tens of millions of mainly male, well-paid jobs gone. So men who used to have a place at a factory are now working for Home Depot or Walmart, the biggest employer, and have no way of getting seniority and no union. And what happened was a real crisis, particularly a crisis of families, because before that, in union wages were family wages. A man got a high enough wage that he could support a dependent wife and children. And so he could have a full-time servant at home, taking care of his household, taking care of his emotional needs, linking him up socially with his relatives and his children, taking care of social events to come to the home, and taking care of his sexual needs. Well, women had to flood into the workforce, which they do. 75% of women with children are now in the workforce because even with two people working, they couldn't make as much as a family wage made. Well, what happened then was men feeling insecure, wanted more household labor, sexual labor, and emotional labor from their wives. Their wives didn't want to do a second shift, as Arlie Hochschild called it in her best-selling book, The Second Shift, when they got home to do all the work they used to do full-time. And so women withdrew from marriage and from men. For the first time in our history, the majority of American women are single and by choice. And so the old joke that women drag men to the altar, no way. Blue-collar men who can't support a dependent wife don't get wives as much as they used to and don't get all that labor. And it was a real crisis for men because also if you work in a factory and are in a union, you're socially connected. You're part of the union bowling team and the union credit union and so on. There are fewer people involved in any activities today than were in bowling leagues alone in 1970. There's a good book called Bowling Alone that goes over this, and that study has been repeated over and over again with the same results. It may be changing now as people are alarmed and joining marches and movements. The biggest march ever happened October 18th, where people who opposed Trump got together in 2,700 towns and cities across the United States. But men were disempowered and women left, and the family was assailed. Women opted out of marriage, and the idea that they had to work and do all the domestic work. Men were left and feeling dethroned by not having a male wage and not having a woman to take care of them. And there was a personal crisis, so that now the majority of women are single. Now women are on a birth strike, because if you have to work full time and also bring up children, that's incredibly hard. And daycare and childcare are not paid for by our government. You know, in countries like Holland and France and all over the Nordic countries, childcare is free, starting at 3 years old in France and all over. And before that, there's maternity and paternity leaves up to 5 years. When if you take the whole 5 years, you still get 80% of your pay, and you have a job guarantee at the same pay level when you come back. We have no paid maternity and paternity leave. We're the only developed country in the world that doesn't have that. We're only 5 countries in the world don't have that. And there are places like Papua New Guinea, several under 1 million people in the Pacific Islands, Somalia, and Swaziland. Whoa. And so Americans are suffering. The average, which means as much above as below, child care cost for an infant care is $22,000 and change a year. That obviously doesn't work. And the majority of marriages end in separation or divorce. Now, it's not always formal separation or divorce, because a divorce costs on average $7,000. So couples who don't have assets to fight over, or children that they want to fight over and don't want to make an agreement, just agree to split and have an agreement between them, which usually leaves women overwhelmed with childcare and having to work. And there's a motherhood penalty at work, so that mothers get about 20% less than everyone else, because employers figure out, and I think correctly, that mothers will be the ones responsible for children. So if they have to stay home and take care of a child, it's not like these other countries that have a sick room with a registered nurse all the time. No, they'll have to stay home, and so they'll be less reliable, whereas fathers get a fatherhood bonus, because they figure they'll work harder because they're fathers. So that women are opting out of what was the family. That is a huge transformation, because in America, family was the social safety net. There wasn't support for children. There wasn't support for women. There wasn't huge union support for workers. And so people are in a precarious position. Their jobs have been outsourced. And I must say that the left in countries like France, Germany, the Nordic countries, and Holland, all organized against outsourcing. In Sweden, if you want to outsource your factory, you have to get every single worker an equivalent job before you outsource anything. So they're better off producing something else than closing their factory. Here, the boss can close the factory, knock out hundreds of people's jobs, and in en masse, thousands and thousands of well-paid jobs, and people's lives are precarious. And that precarity is not only economic, because the economic bleeds into the social, into the family, into children being cared for. And so Americans are in a very precarious and scary situation right now. precarious means, on the edge. 1 in 7 school children in New York City is homeless part of the year. That's real precarity. It means you can't even go to school. And during the pandemic, a lot of schools organized school buses to deliver meals because the free school lunch was the only whole meal that kids had. We're really in trouble. And then Trump has made it, of course, much worse. So that's what precarity means in action right now.
Great. Thank you for that very comprehensive rundown. As you were going through that, you would mention unionization. I have my father's plaque here upon retirement in 1985 from the 110th Street garage in New York. And yeah, I mean, I don't think I know one handful's worth of people that are unionized, myself included right now. They talk about a different time period. And thank you for bringing up also these economic realities about unionization, and then the gender dynamics and how that's thrown everything off. And then that, like you say, has knock-on effects socially, because now you have people that would like to be married, maybe aren't, or whatever, and creates resentment and all sorts of other ripples
Right.
that come out from that. And one of the things with this most recent story of the SNAP benefits, these foods, we used to call them food stamps, and then being cut off likely in a few days' time. One of the things I've noticed too is the and perhaps you will elaborate on this point, but how the ruling class in this country gets the most desperate people to fight amongst themselves. And I brought up this question to a few people lately about, what are you hearing about this, or how are people reacting that including people whose very family members are on this particular program. And it's amazing the conditioning by the media and the ruling class, because these people who are, not living high in the hog, they start, attacking. Oh, look at the welfare queens. Look at these bums. Finally, it's about time they go and get a job and so forth. It is amazing. And we can take this even back to the colonial era, how the ruling class has always set the most poor, desperate people against each other. Do you have any thoughts on that point?
I do. I think the first division they try to foment, and you can really see it with Trump, who's very much a right-winger, is to divide men from women, setting men over women. That's Pete Hegseth in the military, at first advocating getting rid of all the women in the military, only to find out that since they're about a third of the military, that wasn't such a smart idea. And he has demoted every person of color who was in the highest positions, and every woman. And so that one of the ways you control and keep rich and not have any pressure to be taxed or to share is that you pit people at the bottom against each other so they don't see they're all being robbed from the top. So you say that it's immigrants who are 1 or 2 million people it's 2 million or maybe 3 million people out of 330 million in the United States working the worst jobs. 60% of the dishwashers in New York restaurants are immigrants. Dishwashing is not a high prestige profession. And the farm workers, one of the reasons our food prices are going to go haywire is that farm workers who are terribly paid and do stoop labor, which is painful, are frightened to go into the fields because they'll be arrested by ICE or they're deported. And so that, but they have successfully attributed people's poverty and fear to the few immigrants that are around. And they pitted men against women. There's all these incels now, gooners, all sorts of men who feel that uppity women are their problem, or white people that think that black people have taken their jobs, even though they have the worst conditions always, because racial discrimination continues, and that they're wiping out diversity, equity, and inclusion to make white people the victims. And so that, you divide people. You take those who have a little against those who have nothing, and the people at the top are snug and happy. That's a strategy that the fascists used in Germany. Women were in charge of Kirche, Küche, and Kinder only, kitchen, church, and children. And even though, as they were losing, women were forced to work in the munitions factories, they could be paid less because it wasn't their real responsibility, which was home and cleaning and cooking and children. And ironically, they were pushed. Birth control was not allowed. Of course, abortion was not allowed, and they are against abortion here too. But they didn't have more children because women were totally wiped out. So they couldn't even conceive. So one of their strategies is getting everybody fighting at the bottom so they don't look up and see that their wallet's being taken out of their pocket while they're fighting somebody. A very successful strategy. And without a left to counterbalance it, to say we're all in it together, then it's more possible to pit people against each other. And that's what Trump has done. Now, as the majority of people are disempowered and disenfranchised and can't afford to have food, maybe it'll occur that this doesn't work. That's why AOC was elected. That's why I think Mamdani, a Democratic socialist in New York, will be elected. That's why Fateh in Minneapolis will be elected, and various people all over the United States who are saying, no, there's a class problem here. 3% of the United States are employers, 97% are employed. We who are the workers here have got to get together and stop this and make a fair society. Estate taxes, which are the taxes that a rich person can leave their heirs, maybe 25 years ago were $600,000. Now they're $24 million for a couple. That's quite a change that has been achieved by the wealthy overwhelming the Democratic and Republican parties with their donors, because you don't want to offend your donors. And so you become much more right-wing. And all the countries that I cited have elections where it's illegal to make personal campaign contributions. People have 2 weeks to run. They're not allowed to buy TV or radio ads. They can put up posters, and on TV, they have all the candidates describing what they stand for. So money doesn't determine who gets elected. Sarkozy, the ex-president of France, is about to go to jail. You can't do that, and that really helps. It makes things more democratic. If you can't buy that, you don't get the best democracy money can buy. You actually get a democracy. So there are a lot of problems that have to be addressed, and they'll be addressed by a united movement in the United States, which is just starting. And for the first time, union representation is really growing in the United States because people see how they're being discriminated against.
Well, I know, Dr. Fraad, you have an appointment at the bottom of the hour, so maybe just one more major question, and then we can pick up the rest perhaps down the line there. But this has been a fine introduction. You did mention in your previous recording concerning families and the economy at Democracy at Work, which is linked down below. You had mentioned that America So beyond the immediate
Went out for a moment.
precarious situation of youth families in this country. Sorry?
You went out for a moment there.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thank you for that. I I was wondering if you could elaborate, Dr. Fraad, on the expression America is a falling empire. We've looked at some internal stuff with families. If you want to elaborate on that some more, or perhaps take that observation to other international affairs or whatever the case may be. America is a falling empire.
Well, what I mean is, first of all, we have fought in the last wars, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and our proxy war now in Ukraine. We lost all three wars, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. So our empire is not doing so well there. And we are rapidly losing in the Ukraine, where our weapons and our expertise at using them are being employed by the Ukrainians. And so that's one of the things I mean. I also mean that BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and about 22 other nations have formed an alliance which has more of the world's people and as much of the world's money as the G7 and G20, the dominant countries of which we were a part. And that they don't necessarily take orders from the United States. And one of the reasons it looks like Trump is invading Venezuela, which produces no fentanyl and no drugs, on the pretext that he's cleaning up a drug den, which he has no business doing in another country, is that they want to re-annex the South American nations as their empire, because we're failing. We don't have a wealthy empire. And so we don't have a whole lot of money lying around from ripping off other countries. And what we have is being grabbed by the top. And that's been going on since the late 70s, the mid to late 70s. So that, as I said, estate taxes, which were $600,000, allowed for the rich, and that doesn't count the paintings they have and the gold that isn't registered because it's not public, is now 24 million for a couple, 12 million each one, so that they can perpetuate their wealth and not give people at least a somewhat even chance for equality here. So that's what I mean.
Excellent. And we should hope to have you on in the future, Dr. Fraad, about how we build this movement, because we have been so atomized over the past many decades. And certainly this has been exacerbated tremendously by social media and other things the ruling class dumps on us to
Right.
keep divided. Just one final thing. I mean, I was talking to someone today, in fact, saying the economy and, more importantly, the larger society, because these things ripple out, as you pointed out,
Yes.
almost seems like an automobile that's running hot, that doesn't have coolant in it. I mean, the Dow, I checked over the weekend, the Dow is at 43,000 points. And I know people that can't, they're panicking about rent, about car stuff, about keeping gas in the tank. I mean, it's completely unremoved from reality, this so-called market. Something has to blow, whether that's going to be the scrap. Yeah.
It does. 10%. All the stocks and bonds are owned by 10% of the people. That top 10% is doing nicely. Not the 90% of everybody else who are having trouble. And you can't really sustain a society that's that unequal. And Americans are starting to realize they're being ripped off. And they're, a good example is the oil depletion allowance. Oil companies get an oil depletion allowance because when you take oil out of the ground, which we all own, you get a special allowance because you're removing it. That's crazy. But they've managed to push these things by paying for the campaigns of our Congress, which is why they're now rubber stamping all the ripoffs of the Trump regime. And the Democrats have not been strong enough. They didn't stand up against all those Supreme Court appointees that are okaying everything Trump does. And so people are starting to panic and look elsewhere. They're looking to the democratic socialists. They're looking to unions. They're starting to realize they're being ripped off. And it's scary.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. But we will talk about solutions down the line there. But
Yes.
I know you do have an obligation at the bottom of the hour, and we'll
I
give you a
do.
few minutes, Dr. Fradd, to get another cup of tea in you and maybe a sandwich for the midday. But we have your website here. Democracy at Work is in the description. And I encourage all the audience to check that out. I certainly have benefited from Harriet's presentations here, of course, but elsewhere. And then Dr. Wolf and so forth. So Harriet, thank you for your time, and I do indeed look forward to talking to you down the line there.
Thank you. It was good to talk to you. Bye-bye.